My name is Nick the Immunologist, and this is going to be Immunology 101. This is the first lesson. Now, again, if you want to follow along, the textbook that I'll be using is the Janeway Immunobiology book. It's got a lot of great resources, a lot of good information, a lot of things you can follow with, Quizlets, some case studies. A lot of things are packed into this book, and it's why I think it's the best book for learning immunology, and it's why I'm going to use it to teach you guys here. So if you want to follow along, I'm going to have the links here. Links in my bio. You can definitely follow, see what's going on when you get your own book. Now, what is immunology? There are tons of researchers constantly studying the immune system, how effective it is, how well it works, what diseases it interacts with, and how your immune system reciprocates or responds to those diseases, and just a better understanding overall of disease interaction, damage interactions, your body fighting it off, your body trying to protect itself, and then constantly giving that protection throughout your lifetime. So at its core, immunology is the study of a body's defense against infections or pathogens or whatever could be harming you. And then we are continually exposed to microorganisms, some that can cause disease, and yet we rarely get disease when you really think about it. Yes, there's times when you get sick, yearly you get the flu, maybe you're getting that COVID every now and then, and you think it feels kind of often, but in reality, there are so many microorganisms that we interact with every single day, whether you're touching a bathroom stall or whether you're touching your dog's food or, whatever you're doing, whether your baby licks the dirt that came in from the bottom of your shoe. These are things you're constantly interacting with that can cause an illness in you, and yet we don't always get sick. Why? It really comes down to your immune system and how effective it is at fighting off these diseases. Now let's give a little bit of background into immunology. Immunology as a science has been around for quite some time. It's usually attributed to Edward Jenner of the 18th century, as he did some studies to really understand the immune system and different ways to eventually help people survive diseases or prevent themselves from getting sick from a certain disease. But this notion of surviving these diseases, if you interacted with the disease and you eventually will have some type of protection in the future from this disease, this idea has been around even since ancient Greek times. But we find a lot of that attributing credit to Edward Jenner. Now, Jenner found that if you gave someone a mild disease like cowpox, it typically gave them protection against even more dangerous diseases like smallpox. Now, what he did was he initially inoculated or provided this disease to a bunch of people, the cowpox. And then once he provided this cowpox to a bunch of individuals, he then purposely exposed them to the super dangerous smallpox. But what he found was a lot of the people that got this initial disease with cowpox were completely immune from the smallpox. And this was the start of the research that led to vaccinations. Now, it's Black History Month, and I think credit has to be given where credit's due. And Jenner's work wouldn't have been found in the Americas without being built on the back of a slave that initially brought this information about protection against diseases to the general population, or his slave master that eventually tested this idea on a bunch of individuals. And Jenner's work originated from the understanding that this slave brought to the US that eventually led to a bunch of testing in Boston. Now, the slave's name is a West African man named Onesimus, and he came with this information that I told you, this idea of giving a disease that will offer greater protection existed even in ancient Greek times. He knew of this information and brought this along with him, learning from people of the Middle East and people from China, this idea that if you took the liquid or the pus, that nasty stuff from a smallpox bubble that someone may have, and you smeared it on someone's wound, I know, very, very disgusting. But what ended up happening is the people that were given this nasty, smallpox juice could eventually be protected from future infections of smallpox. Now, Onesimus heard of these stories many times before, and he told these stories to his master, Cotton Mather's, in the 1700s. And then Cotton Mather's took this information and eventually tried to test this same technique on a bunch of residents in Boston in the early 1700s. And then this technique ended up being the groundwork that Edward Jenner eventually built upon in order to create his vaccines using cowpox, similar to how people were using smallpox pus to prevent this increased amount of disease that people would get because now they were protected. So now you got a little bit of the background. So let's dive right into it. What is the immune system? It's a collection of effector cells and molecules that can protect against infectious agents and toxins. And now, majority of the cells in your immune system, and also your red blood cells, come from bone marrow. Yes, your bone marrow is the place where a lot of these cells form, originate, and then are migrated out to spaces that they need to be in. Now, you may say this is very interesting, but if you really think about it, usually when someone has some kind of issue with their blood or some kind of deficiency, they get what's called a bone marrow transplant. It's because the bone marrow of that person is not effective enough at creating the cells that they need, whether it be red blood cells or white blood cells, whatever immune cells. And so you need this transfer of bone marrow in order to make your immune system more effective again. It's a very common transplant needed for people with immunodeficiencies that stop them from fighting off diseases. Now, there's really two parts of the immune system. There's the innate immune system, which is an early response where there's certain cell types that react very quickly to whatever's bothering you. And then there's another part of the immune system called the adaptive immune system. That's a more aggressive form of fighting off diseases that may last longer or try to evade those innate responses. Now, if we look at this picture here, we can kind of start breaking down the difference between the innate and the adaptive immune system. If you look at the ones in blue, that kind of goes down that path of the adaptive immune system. A lot of those cell types don't really trigger at the very start of the infection or whatever's bothering you, but they come in later on as that reinforcement, that heavy hitter to really knock out that dangerous stuff. Now, the stuff in red, that's much more of the innate immune system. They're quick, respond very quickly to the pathogens, and then their job is to essentially get rid of things or break things down to make it not as dangerous and to also make it easier to feed to the adaptive immune system. And so once you go from that top of the list from the cells in the bone marrow, you can see there's one cell type where they all originate from, and it's a multipotent hemipoietic stem cell. This cell is the originator of all the other cells that come from the bone marrow. And then it trickles down into a bunch of other progenitor or early starting cell types that then separate into the innate and the adaptive immune system. And so from there, you can really figure out who's the fast-acting responders and then who's that tough-hitting reinforcement that comes in later. Now, as we go through these lessons, we're going to break down more information about all of those cell types. But as these cell types exit the bone marrow, they then enter something called the lymphatic system. It's a way in which, similar to your veins and arteries and blood vessels, it's a way in which a lot of these white blood cells traffic, and then they go blood, lymph, is really they're circulating from the blood to these organs called lymph nodes. And a lot of these cells will sit in lymph nodes and do a lot of their activation and necessary processes to fight off diseases or just sit in limbo until they're ready. And you'll just see them traffic throughout this lymphatic system until the cell's necessary for it to perform a response. So it's typical to understand that cells, once they've formed, once they've matured in different organs that we'll talk about later, they then just keep trafficking blood to lymph, and this is the lymphatic system that all of these cells utilize. Now you might say, Nick, there's two parts of the immune system, but what's the time frame from an illness? How long is this innate response? How long is this adaptive response? When do you even get healed? Let's break it down. So the innate response, like I said, is early. It triggers based off of, whatever the pathogen you're responding to, different components of the pathogen, and that happens within minutes. And then the way your cells react to this, the duration of this response is usually lasts for a few days. This is where a lot of those early cell types will break down these pathogens. They'll secrete proteins that will attract other cells, and they'll try to do as much work as possible to limit this response. Now, once it's determined that this response can't be eliminated quickly, there's an interaction that occurs to now draw in the adaptive immune response. Now, this takes a few hours, but then this response lasts for several days also. And this is where you'll start to incorporate those cells on the blue side that I was talking about, mainly T cells and B cells, which are very important cells that we'll discuss later on, but they're the heavy hitters of the adaptive immune response. And then as you clear whatever pathogens, you'll start to also get memory or cells that can remember this response. So that way, if it ever occurs again, they're ready to act much quicker than this initial response you see here. Now, this is also important in that, remember when I was talking about blood, lymph? This is the point in which if you were infected with something, the cells don't just go blood lymph anymore because you're usually infected in some kind of tissue or specific spot. So they go blood, lymph, get that activation, and now they go back to blood and then to the tissue that needs to be reacted to in order to clear this pathogen, infection, whatever it is. And then at that point, you're good. You're safe. But if something occurs again, you develop immunological responses to protect yourself in the future from a lot of these diseases. Now, I keep referring to a lot of these things as pathogens. There's really 4 broad categories of disease-causing microorganisms that people really refer to when thinking about the things that can harm you. And all these microorganisms can be called pathogens, but they include viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites. And they differ in size, function, and the way that they can damage the host. Now, there's a few different steps that your body takes in order to prevent these pathogens from affecting you. These are anatomical barriers like skin or epithelial cells of different organs. Then there's some early responses called complement, which is really ways that it can try to kill these organisms super early. And then from there, your innate immune cells from the innate immune system can kick in and try to create responses to break these things down. And then if all else fails, it's time to go to the adaptive immune system, in which a lot of those heavy hitters will eventually try to knock things out. Now, in each of these steps, there's different proteins or inflammatory responses that can be created. There's different forms of inflammatory inducers that will recruit cells to the spot. There's different cells once there that can sense what's going on and whether it's one of these 4 pathogens, and then tell other cells, hey, here's the weapons you need to bring to be ready to get rid of this stuff. And then there's these different proteins or mediators that have tons of different functions that we'll get into later, called cytokines and chemokines, that can create toxic environments or create more inflammation to fight off these diseases. And then these cells also have specific ways to target tissues that are infected or cells that are infected and perform these killing functions as soon as possible. Now, I talked about 4 broad categories of these microorganisms called pathogens. There's viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasitic worms. But what are some examples? Like flu or influenza. There's some examples like Toxoplasma gondii for those bacteria, strep for the fungi. There's a lot of different things that can really bother you. And this is just a short list you can view here of the specific things that will cause the disease and then the names of the disease that can form. You got smallpox, leprosy, flu, tetanus, pneumonia. The list can go on. And as we've seen, there's plenty of things out there that can affect us. And so this gives you an idea of where all of these things fit into those 4 categories of things that can harm you as a person. Now, going back to our cell chart that we looked at earlier, with those different pathogens, those 4 broad categories, there's specifically responses from different cells that will occur. Now, again, your cells originate from in the bone marrow with the multipotent hematopoietic stem cells, but then they break off into 2 different what's called common progenitor cells. One's a common lymphoid progenitor cell, which will give rise to a lot of the adaptive immune system cells. And then there's a common myeloid progenitor cell, which will give rise to a lot of the innate immune system cells that can fight off these initial responses. So we're going to dive into the innate part first, those common myeloid progenitor cells and what they grow into, and then we'll get to the adaptive cells in a later lesson. Now I'm going to break up these innate cells that come from the common myeloid progenitor line into 2 broad categories. We're going to call them granulocytes for one, and then the other category that we'll go through next is going to be called phagocytic cells. So the granulocytes, the reason why they're called this is because they literally have granules or little holes or pockets that are full of a bunch of proteins and different enzymes and things that they can secrete when necessary. And so the 4 cells that we're going to talk about that contain these granules are neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, and mast cells. Now, first with the neutrophils, they can kind of act in a way in which they can absorb material or absorb these invaders, and they provide phagocytic activity. So when they take up these microorganisms, these invaders, they can destroy them by putting them in these pockets, these granules, and then releasing degradative enzymes that can eventually destroy these things. Now, the next 2 cells we're talking about, eosinophils and basophils, they act a little bit differently. They don't really absorb material to then break it down. What they do is they release the contents of their granules to create these toxic proteins or toxic chemicals almost that can attached to something that's too large to be taken up into a granule and too large to be undergoing phagocytosis. And then at this point, it'll trigger alarmins that'll tell other cells, hey, this parasite is too large, but it's coated in a lot of these toxic things. It's time to break it down and kill it. Unload all the toxic weapons to kill that parasite. And so that's kind of what the eosinophils and basophils do. Now, lastly is the mast cells. And mast cells, they're a little bit different in terms of where they go and where they traffic in the body. They typically end up in the tissues of your body. Now, mast cells also have granules, but they're packed full of inflammatory mediators that can also attack these parasitic worms. And they can also secrete things that will trigger other early responses or sensors that will tell other cells that they need to come here to this site and act efficiently and immediately. And then so it really contributes to a lot of that early inflammation. Now, another little thing about mast cells is that they also have histamine inside of their granules. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about antihistamines. So when you have an allergic response, histamine is what drives you to, runny nose, cough sometimes, scratchy throat, whatever those feelings are. And so you need an antihistamine to block the effects of histamine that have been released from the mast cells. So mast cells also contribute heavily to allergy responses as well. Now, for that other category of the innate immune cells, the phagocytic cells, it's mainly going to be macrophages and dendritic cells. Now, these cells, their role is way different than the ones that have the granules that can secrete different proteins. Macrophages, what they do is they will engulf entire pathogens, and then similar to how neutrophils can do this with phagocytosis, except it has a greater ability to do this with even larger materials. And it can also function in not just the innate immune system, but also the adaptive immune system, in which when the adaptive immune cells perform their actions, macrophages can clean up all the mess, get rid of all the debris, and eat it up. So their job, they're the big eaters. They love to eat. Now, macrophages also can be a bridge for the other immune cells, especially within the innate immune system, in that they can orchestrate immune responses. So when they start to phagocytose and eat materials up, they can also secrete proteins, typically called chemokines, that can then recruit other cells. Now, this will be the start of inflammation. If you know, inflammation is really just the idea that a bunch of immune cells are coming together and congregating in order to perform their function. But they have to be recruited to these spots, whether it's in the tissue or wherever the damage is. And macrophages is one of those big recruiters for these other immune cells. Now, the other cell type of the phagocytic cells is the dendritic cell. And dendritic cells, similar to macrophages, can take up a lot of these materials for phagocytosis, but instead of breaking down and destroying the material, they actually break them down into small pieces, and then they can use these small pieces to then show to what's called the T cells of the adaptive immune system. And so they are essentially the bridge between the innate and the adaptive immune response. We'll go in detail about this later on, but it's important to know these cooperate. Innate is brought to the adaptive by way of the dendritic cell. So as I said, with macrophages, they have this ability to recruit other immune cells. They have a lot of receptors or proteins that can detect other proteins on the surface of their cell. And these can detect several different things depending on what these pathogens or microorganisms are. And it doesn't allow a lot of these things to invade because it has so many different receptors that can detect DNA, RNA, protein material, garbage, whatever it is. And then once it detects it, it can release the correct signals to start recruiting other cells in the innate and adaptive immune system to come say, hey, this is what we're dealing with. This is what I need your help with. And so this really is the start of that innate immune system. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to go a little bit more into the adaptive immune system and some of the cell types that are present there and what they do before we start doing an even deeper dive into each of these cell types, their proteins they make, the actions and functions they have. So be ready for that next lesson in part 2 of this chapter 1, where we'll discuss more about the adaptive immune system.